Hello, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on navigating communication in clinical trials. I'm Shelley Fold-Nasso, CEO of Cancer Nation, and I'm really grateful to you for joining us today. We have three wonderful speakers who are experts in different perspectives on clinical trials and clinical trial enrollment. And I'm really grateful to all of them for joining us and for all of you for joining us today. I also want to thank Lily for sponsoring this webinar and the Cancer Nation team. So we are going to talk about communication today, but we also know that communication is not the only barrier to clinical trial enrollment. So we're also going to talk about some of the structural barriers that make it difficult that result in people not being offered trials. We know that clinical trials are incredibly important to both offer treatment options for people undergoing cancer treatment, but also to advance the science of the different treatments that we have in the pipeline. And we also know that the clinical trial participation rates are low, and we don't always have the diversity of participation in clinical trials. So I'm really happy to have today with us Kristi Mitchell from Health Equity Outcomes, Dr. Dizon from Tufts Medicine, and Dr. Joseph Unger from the Fred Hutch Cancer Center. And so I'm not going to go into their bios because they have lengthy bios with many accolades. So we will put that in the chat so that you can read about them, and we'll save time for the conversation. Also, just want to note that we will share a recording of this webinar after the fact, and we will also take questions at the end, so you can use the Q&A button to ask questions. We're mostly going to be in discussion. We're not doing a lot of slides, but I want to start by setting the stage with some data that we've collected from our State of Survivorship Survey. So I'm going to share those slides quickly, and then we'll get into the conversation. So in 2024, we conducted the State of Survivorship Survey for the 6th year. We have our 2025 survey will be out in the field in the very near future, in the next week or so. We ask regularly our participants in our survey if they participated in a clinical trial, and we also ask if they were asked to participate in a clinical trial. And usually we don't see a huge delta between the percent who said they participated and who said that they were asked. So, and you can see 9 or 10% over every year say they did participate. And we see that it's higher among certain groups: younger patients, Hispanic patients, Black patients, people still in treatment, people who are connected to our organization. So we find that the people connected to us are more empowered and engaged patients, and they are more likely to have to really do the research to find out about clinical trials. So we went further in our survey in 2024 and asked about the why behind the participation. So what influenced your decision to participate? And for those who did participate, and number one was the doctor's recommendation, followed by wanting to help contribute to science and help others. But then we asked the people who did not choose to participate in a clinical trial why they didn't. And overall, 74% said they didn't because they were not asked to participate. And then after that were concerns about eligibility, side effects, concerns about the type of treatment, et cetera. We did see differences. So younger patients were less likely to say they weren't asked, which the corollary is they were more likely to be asked to participate. And for them, it was other reasons that caused them not to participate. So there was a higher level of concern about side effects, about the type of treatment, about costs, especially for younger patients. That was much higher for them. And same with a couple of the other, different groups. We kind of break out where we see differences in certain demographic groups. So when we asked if people did not participate, why, what influenced their decision, 74% said they were not asked, followed by not eligible. And then younger patients were less likely to say they weren't asked, which means they were more likely to be asked. So I think, this is an important part of the conversation. I just wanted to share this to set the stage for the discussion, because I think while we're talking about communication and how important that is, we also need to talk about the structural barriers. So we will be addressing that in the conversation. So now I want to start the conversation, and I know that Dr. Dizon is joining us. He has clinic today, so he will maybe in and out of the conversation because he is a practicing oncologist and his patients come first. So he will be here shortly. But I want to start with Kristi, and you come to this from the perspective of working in the community to try to ensure equity and participation in clinical trials. And you've done a lot of community focused work in Indianapolis to understand barriers to clinical trial participation. So, can you talk a little bit about what you've learned from that, and an example of how community engagement revealed some of those communication barriers that weren't apparent from the clinical setting? And what did you learn from those community conversations about how oncologists should approach clinical trial discussions with their patients?
Thank you, Shelley. I really and truly am delighted for this opportunity to discuss this topic and share some observations and lessons learned in the space. As you pointed out, in 2022, we were in partnership with the Boston-based Network for Excellence in Healthcare Innovation called NEHI. We launched a community-focused research organization. You'll hear me refer to it as a CRFO in Indianapolis, with the goal of building ongoing infrastructure of community-based organizations, health systems, researchers. We had faith-based organizations, as well as payers to support access to and participation among underserved and underrepresented populations in clinical trials. And so we held several listening sessions with the community. And through that, we identified and prioritized a number of barriers. We finally were able to collate those down to about 13. And once we did that, we thought, okay, it's great to know what the barriers are, but how do we close those barriers? So we implemented a train the trainer model with a local church, and we sought to really address what are some of those barriers and how we can get more folks interested in participating in clinical trials. So through that process, we found that the barriers identified fell across three major domains. The first one was trust. This, again, should not come to any surprise to anyone, but that is like the fact that we were not meeting people where they are. The power of negative storytelling, the historic mistrust of the healthcare system, all of that sort of wound its way in and around this domain of trust. The second area was access. That is, are there trials in the area? What are individual financial constraints to participating in trials? And so on and so forth. But the biggest area, believe it or not, was engagement, both at the community level and between doctors and patients. And that's the focus of today's discussion. And so when you asked me, what did we learn that might impact how oncologists may wish to approach clinical trial discussions? I have some thoughts here. The first is really homing in on this notion of trust and transparency. And what does that mean? What am I saying? It is, providing the most relevant information in the most culturally appropriate fashion to potential participants. We also learned about the role of a trusted messenger, and they come in many shapes and sizes and roles, but they typically are those who amplify opportunities around clinical trial participation overall. And the community shared with us that it could be a faith-based leader, it could be a community health worker, but they were essential in providing messaging around the value of clinical trials, such that when an oncologist seeks to, have that conversation with a patient, it's not foreign. It's something that's been spoken to before. The community further underscored the role and importance of health literacy, right? Do we have the right literacy level? Are we recognizing cultural appropriate language? They said it's incredibly important to understand local community norms like religion, taboos, family structures, and thus clinicians having cultural competency and humility to address those community norms. And then finally, as I said, the big bucket was around effective communication. Because effective communication really bridges the gap between the researchers in the community as well as between doctors and patients. And it ultimately comes down to listening and truly understanding the fears, the concerns, the needs of participants and their families. And so, those all those factors emerge as being truly important. And I really think that that's something that can set the foundation for our conversation today.
Great. Thank you very much, Kristi. Really appreciate that. Hi, Dr. Dizon. So glad you could be here. I know you're really busy in clinic today, so thank you so much. I want to turn to you and ask you, as we didn't go into details on the bios, but we shared a link to your bio and included in that is your participation with SWOG. Can you talk about some of the specific strategies or tools that the cooperative group has implemented to help your member institutions to improve patient enrollment in trials?
Yeah, sure. And I'm happy to join both Kristi and my friend Joe Unger from SWOG as well. I think the biggest thing that the cooperative group systems have incorporated, and this is actually, speaking to it a lot of what Kristi had just mentioned regarding the patient voice and being, culturally competent. There's been a big movement to incorporate patients and advocates into the earliest part of clinical trial planning and design. And that is something that SWOG has embraced. We have put in place actually really standardized team science. And the team doesn't mean investigators from multiple institutions in and of themselves. It means people like Dr. Unger and his work in statistics are involved at the ground level when a hypothesis is being generated. But it also means that advocates, patients, the representatives from that community within that committee are also involved in the study as it is being designed, so that we're not surprised at the end of the day that, say, a trial is not accruing or that a trial is not at a diversity of sites because we didn't think about X, Y, or Z. So it's the embrace of, I think, patient advocates into the work that we're doing that has really been the biggest revolution in how clinical trials are designed and in the entire enterprise. And, going forward, we have these committee structures in recruitment of people into trials, as well as retaining them into trials that hopefully are a mechanism that each clinical trial team can get to in case they're projecting that there may be issues in completing a trial on time or undersampling of the representative populations. SWOG has also implemented membership as well as accrual as a really important piece of their work. And they actually initiated a leadership position, not only for the entire group, but also to elevate the community voice and how SWOG operates. So we have an executive officer now that speaks towards the incorporation of the community center voice into what our trials are doing. And then, I can point to a highlight of, one of our committees in lung who had someone act as a network navigator that essentially goes to the sites and helps to bridge what the network at SWOG is trying to accomplish and how each site actually helps us partner in terms of achieving those goals. So it's not unidirectional then. The protocol is provided to the sites, and oftentimes we heard that the sites had no way to get feedback into how to get these trials to be more welcoming, especially in community center sites rather than the academic center sites. And this one person who was a navigator for a very important and high profile phase 3 lung trial actually went to specific institutions where they were seeing the populations we wanted to ensure were represented in our trials and provided that singular contact within the network that could get feedback delivered and responses delivered in a way that was more proactive and timely so that we could problem solve things in real time as they went forward. I think the whole point of that, and I think Dr. Unger's work was so instrumental in a lot of this, was that to ensure that our trials were effective in today's society, we need to broaden who was in the room planning them. And that was a very critical component of how the National Cancer Trials Network operate. And certainly it is at the heart of what we're trying to do at SWOG.
Thank you. And could you share any examples of how having patients and advocates in the design actually improved the design of the trial to make it more friendly for patients to want to join?
Well, there's this new language that is sort of it's a new mantra within the National Cancer Trials Network, and it's pragmatic. Okay.
Yeah.
And if you go back 10 years ago, trials were very precise, but not in a way that was specific to the trial. There was just a set of rules that governed who could enter a clinical trial, and no one really gave it a thought. It was something that was just carried on and passed on, from trial to trial, generation to generation. But then we realized that that was leading to exclusionary practices, that people weren't being allowed to enter these trials because our eligibility criteria was speaking towards a very specific population of people who had that disease rather than being more welcoming. The idea of being pragmatic is to sort of adopt what is going on in the real world and how can we get this trial into the hands of investigators so they can help their populations rather than cherry picking from that. So, the work that was done between the cooperative groups and the American Society of Clinical Oncology and, Cancer Nation, as well as the NCTN, to sort of look more broadly at criteria and say, which criteria are really critical for which trial, rather than saying this is the criteria and all trials need to have the same criteria. One example is, do you really need to exclude people who have a chronic illness like HIV because they're on antiretrovirals? That was a universal exclusion criteria. And the question was, why is that a universal exclusion criteria? There were kidney function parameters for a drug that was being metabolized in the liver, for example. So the question was, do you need these criteria, which is not relevant at all to how this drug is being used in our bodies? So it was this drive to say, use the criteria that are specific and make it broad enough. But went beyond just who gets in, but it's also what was expected of them once they were in these trials. I think there is a time, there is a financial toxicity to clinical care, and we don't want clinical trials to add on to that if it's not in support of an objective. And I think the physicians that work at SWOG, and certainly Dr. Unger is a huge example of this, was really to question, what do you need to collect and why are you collecting it? Rather than saying, let's collect everything and figure out what we're going to do with the data afterwards. So, if you look at the Pragmatica lung trial, they didn't collect every single toxicity that happened in that clinical trial. They were very concerned with the side effects that were severe that landed people in the hospital. Everything else, we're not going to really review, we're not going to focus on everything. We're going to focus in on what's important. And the burden of the collection of that data, the burden of having people having to come in multiple times was part of that. And I think that whole idea of pragmatic clinical trial designs, relooking at eligibility criteria, all of that reflected a partnership, and patients were central into that kind of work.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful explanation. So, Dr. Unger, I want to turn to you because, you noted that communication isn't always the issue, that there are these structural issues and barriers to clinical trial participation. You've done a lot of research on this. Can you share a little bit about, talk to us about some of those structural barriers?
Absolutely. And if I could just try to share my screen, it would be helpful, I think, for the
Yeah.
audience. And yes, also very thankful for being here today. Appreciate your having me. So this figure on the right is really an attempt to identify what are the major barrier domains that preclude patients from participating in trials. And just to take a step back, if I could, patient advocates have informed my scientific pursuits because this effort, as represented in this paper, was really my attempt to square an equation that wasn't making sense to me, which was patient advocate and patient passion for clinical trials and clinical research standing in contradiction to the statistic that we always have heard, or at least heard for 30 years, that less than 5% of patients, usually 2 to 3% of patients, adult cancer patients, go on to clinical trials. Now those statistics are old, as it turns out. They're about 30 years old. And there are more modern statistics. But nonetheless, regardless, it didn't sort of marry up. And so this was an attempt to take a look at the system as a system from a 30,000-foot perspective and sort of follow through step by step how, in a simplified fashion, a patient may go about a treatment decision-making process. Because the literature, as we all know, is going back decades, has somewhat inadvertently, I think, put the onus on patients for non-participation. And I don't really think, given these results, that that's the case. So initially, you would have a cancer diagnosis, there would be a clinic visit. When there is a clinic visit, there would be an assessment of whether or not a trial is available. Then, if there's a trial available, there would be an assessment about whether or not the patient is eligible. Then, and only then, is there an opportunity for there to be an interaction between the physicians and the patients. As it turns out, for more than half of patients, there simply is no locally available trial, 56%. Another quarter of patients are clinically ineligible for many of the reasons that Dr. Dizon just mentioned, sort of the buildup of trial exclusion criteria over decades and what have you. All well-intended, trial exclusion criteria or eligibility criteria have been, put in place in part for patient safety, but they had kind of taken on a life of their own. And so there's been a big effort, as Dr. Dizon mentioned, to modernize those. And I think it's been very successful. But so you can see here that for more than 3 out of 4 patients, there simply isn't even that opportunity to have that interaction with their physician, which, by the way, marries up pretty closely, Shelley, with the statistics that you mentioned at the beginning. The 74% are simply not offered. This raises the question, secondarily, well, okay, so it's really patient agency only comes into play at the end of this long pathway. So the onus really isn't on the patient. It's really on the system. There simply oftentimes is not a locally available trial for which patients are eligible. It gives rise to a second question then is, okay, well, what happens when patients are actually offered the opportunity to participate? And in another study that we did, what we found is that among patients for whom there's a trial available, they're eligible, they're offered the opportunity to participate, they agree to participate more than half the time. 50%, 60%, which really stands on its head, that commonly cited statistic that less than 5% of patients agree to go on to trials, which is really a statistic that just fails to reflect all these structural and clinical barriers that get in the way most of the time. Patients are very passionate about clinical research and very willing in general to participate in a clinical trial if one is offered. Finally, and this is my very roundabout way of getting to the point of communication in my own field, that statistic that more than half of patients agree to go on a trial, participate if they're offered, did not differ by race or ethnicity. In fact, the rates among Black patients, Hispanic patients, Asian patients were numerically somewhat higher than for white patients, although they were all quite high, above 50%. What does this suggest? This suggests that the idea that some patients may be preferentially less likely to participate in a trial for historical trust reasons, what have you, which may be true, may not actually play out when it's actually at the cusp of actually offering them a trial. They may actually be more than willing to participate. And finally, what is the best way then to get patients to participate in trials and to better ensure a diverse population? Simply ask, right? That's the key to communication. Simply ask if they are interested in participating. So that's my little soliloquy here about this issue, getting around about to participation. But I agree with everything Dawn said and everything that Dr. Mitchell said. But it really is, at the end of the day, the onus is not on the patients. I really don't think it has been on the patients. Surely there are reasons that patients don't go on to trials, and those need to be addressed because that is a potential enrollment right there. And we need to make sure that patients who really want to go on to trials are not unduly burdened by barriers. But if we really want to move the needle in the system, we have to address these structural and clinical issues.
Thank you, Dr. Unger. I like your soliloquy, and I channel you a lot when I talk about this, and I refer people to your work because I do feel like the focus so much is on we need to educate patients about clinical trials. And I feel like we don't pay enough attention to how do we address the structural barriers. And so, how do we? What are some of the things we can do to address those structural barriers? And how do we, decentralize trials so that they're offered in the community more? So they're offered when, if more than half are not near a trial, how do we improve that? I know, and I'm asking anyone who wants to contribute to that, but I know that, Dr. Unger, you said you're going to the NCORP meeting. I know that's a big focus, so I'd love to hear from all of you about that.
Well, I have a very short answer, if I could. Well, you have two options. You can either bring the patients to the trials or the trials to the patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the strategy of the NCORP program, which is the NCI's Community Oncology Outreach Program, has demonstrated tremendous success in bringing trials to patients. And we have seen that in our own research, where we have compared representation, specifically of Black and Hispanic patients, in SWOG trials compared to trials that are conducted by industry, which are largely, and say predominantly, conducted at large urban academic centers where they have all the bells and whistles that they need to file their indication. As it turns out, there was a paper in 2019 by some colleagues at British Columbia, and they showed that enrollment of Black patients to pivotal trials that lead to an FDA indication was 3% compared to an expected proportion of 14% for the trials that they looked at. Really egregious underrepresentation. Now, some of that is accounted for by the international nature of industry trials, but by no means all of it. I collaborated with them to do a matched analysis where we compared representation in SWOG trials as a manifestation of the NCORP network compared to industry trials. Because that statistic did not sit with me well. I knew that that wasn't right for the studies that we've worked on. And it turned out that Black representation, when you match by cancer type and year of enrollment, was 3 times greater. It was 9% in the SWOG trials compared to that 3% in the industry trials. In my view, that really shows the benefit of reaching out to community and minority and underserved sites with trial programs. And I think that the FDA has, even in their latest guidance, somewhat implicitly instructed the industry to have a broader geographic reach when they conduct their trials, because I think they're starting to take to heart that idea that they need to get outside the large academic centers only and reach out to communities to better not just enroll patients, but achieve better diversity in their enrollment.
Kristi or Dr. Dizon, do you want to, yeah, Kristi, you want to chime in and then
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to also thank you, Dr. Unger, for sharing that framework because I think it's so instructive and it's so timely and it's so spot on with what we saw just in the microcosm within Indianapolis. The lion's share of the community members that participated in this ongoing research organization, community focused research organization, stated that it wasn't that they didn't want to participate in the trial. They said very quite clearly they were not asked. But the other thing that they talked about was clinical trials were not top of mind. So while we're talking about clinical trials, they're talking about food insecurity, housing, transportation, and other social needs that really sort of are top of mind. And they're also thinking about their family, right? So if they were to participate in a trial, well, what's going to happen to the rest of my family while I am off doing those things? And that was sort of the framing in which they described this. And so just again, underscores the need to dive in more concretely in those structural barriers and coming up with really concrete solutions to addressing them initially. Because it's not only about recruiting, it's the retention part of the trials that really stand to bear if we don't get it right. I just wanted to reflect on that because the community was very clear that yes, we know about Tuskegee. That's to the side, right? That is not what's driving us right now. What's driving us is that we've got very right now in our face social needs that we need to have addressed.
Yeah, I think, one of the other things is that no one should view all trials as the same, right? There are certain trials that expect very little in terms of patient investments of their own time. If we're doing a patient-reported outcomes study, or if we're looking at a diagnostic endpoint, those are they're inherently going to be different from a therapeutic trial of an already established drug versus a therapeutic trial of a completely investigational drug. The demands on time are going to be different. The rarity of the cancer is going to make some trials more challenging than other trials. And I think it might be, and I don't know how you think about that, in terms of engaging communities into being activated, into thinking about trials. That's actually a harder thing to accomplish than one would think. When I did my work with the community outreach and engagement group when I was at Brown, this came up. It's like, let's try to reach our very large Latinx, Hispanic populations, which were coming from Puerto Rico as well as the Dominican Republic. They weren't the same community. There were different communities. But, we're like, oh, well, we'll do a radio program on clinical trials and why they're important. And our host was like, if you don't ground it in an Oregon site, no one's going to show up for that. No one's going to show up for, say, why clinical trials are important because no one sees themselves as needing a clinical trial.
Yeah.
If you say why we're looking at fatigue as a side effect of treatment, what can we do about that? That granularity will speak to some, but not to others.
Mhm.
And, using the format of how we reach people is going to be different. I get all the, questions all the time. How can we use social media, to start conversations on trials? And I always say the same thing back. Who are you trying to reach? Because that's going to tell you what the channel is. If you just say, we're going to go on TikTok and talk clinical trials, don't be shocked when you're not engaging with a community that's going to enroll in your trial. So there just has to be a lot more thought about trials are not just one big basket. Trials are going to be different. And the last thing we want someone to say, I'm going to do a trial because I was told trials are great, thinking it was going to be, I just come in for a drug and then I'm going to be contacted by phone or through my portal for the next 6 weeks. And then I just have to come in for my drug again, only be told, oh no, you have to be here 3 days in a row. We're going to collect blood every 6 hours and you have to stay in a hotel overnight, which we're not going to pay for. I think the impressions of clinical trials is really, it requires a lot more thought about how we communicate that. But I don't think we're in a situation, especially today, where we're going to just lump everything together. Pragmatism has something to do with getting people into trials because it removes those structural barriers, but the messaging has become far more sophisticated than what we're doing now.
Far more sophisticated, but it's inherent in what you've just said, that trust is wound around that. So when you don't have the precision in the language that you are sort of using, you are opening up the channels for greater distrust within a community that's already like, whoa, I'm not sure I want to do this. Not really, right? So I'd like to underscore what you just said about the communication channels and the need to really understand and revisit the language that's being used, the words, to not provide misinformation or disinformation around something that could be it could be an experience that would be extremely beneficial to the patient.
Can I,
Oh, well, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Unger.
oh, well, another, there periodically, but especially in the last decade, clinical trials have, as an endeavor, have begun to undergo major reforms, I would say. And Dawn mentioned one aspect, which was revisiting trial eligibility criteria. But another one recently as well is revisiting trial processes. And this is, again, to the points that Kristi and Dawn have made. They're really about listening to the patients who are saying, make trials easier for us, and we will come, right? And that a lot of that came out of the pandemic, as it turns out. There are a lot of, you mentioned, Shelley, the idea of decentralization. Well, ideas about how to decentralize trials have been kicked around for decades. But when the pandemic hit and clinical research kind of went in the tank immediately, um, sponsors pivoted dramatically to adopt all of these decentralization methods. And it was kind of created this kind of natural experiment where we could, as it turns out, evaluate whether or not they had adverse consequences on trial conduct, because that had been always the barrier to adopting these kinds of decentralized elements. And I'm talking here about things like, remote consent. That's a lot easier for a patient. They don't have to travel tens or hundreds of miles to consent. Remote receipt of oral agents or local monitoring with their own provider, these kinds of things. That makes trials a lot easier to do. And patients have been demanding it. As it turns out, we've done some research with ASCO and Forensic Cancer Research, and we showed that it did not have adverse consequences on data quality or the conduct of clinical research. That is the widespread adoption of these decentralized elements. Now, there's always inertia in the system. There's inertia on the part of especially industry because they want to make sure, understandably, that they don't adopt something that's going to somehow harm their application for a new drug approval. So there has to be communication between them and the FDA. But it's a really another sort of major reform that's of trial processes that's happening now. And again, I think, to Dawn and Kristi's points, it's about patient advocates and the community saying, we want to be eligible for trials and we want them to be easier. And that's to do. And I think that that's happening.
So, we see a big difference between patient advocates and then the broader community. So I'm interested in a couple questions on language that we use. Several of you mentioned language, and I've heard people say maybe we shouldn't even call it clinical trials. We should just call it clinical research. I don't know if that would be better, given especially, with the misinformation and distrust of science that we've been seeing over the last few years in some parts of the country. And then also timing, like when do you talk about it? Because I've, heard people talk about, well, we need to do just broad education campaigns about clinical trials. I've always been skeptical of that. Like, I don't think people are going to think about clinical trials till they're in a situation where they need it. So talking to just the general public about it doesn't, to me, seem effective, but I'm interested if in your thoughts. And even Kristi, you're saying that people who may have a need for it, it's still not top of mind because of they have other priorities. So I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on both timing and language.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that. It's something that's, quite important to me is just, how we speak about cancer and, for our patients as well as the broader community. First off, I'll say I completely agree with you, Shelley, in terms of how we engage people on clinical trials in the broader public is a very difficult thing. Quite frankly, trying to get people without cancer to care about anything cancer related is a very hard thing to communicate, just cancer itself. Cancer is something that people aren't going to want to learn about or just are not interested in until someone they know or they themselves are dragged into this community and realize the breadth of support that they can get from the community. But no one joins this community of cancer advocates, people living through it or professionals within it without an interest. And quite frankly, in the broader public, this falls way below other things people care about, which is, this is why influencers that sell makeup and marketing, they are who they are because I think that's where the public's attention is. It doesn't mean it's any less important. So I have been trying to work with partners and trying to inform the public about things that are cancer adjacent or are cancer related in a way that we're learning from marketing techniques. What is the key? Not to going viral necessarily, but to get that engagement. And there's some really interesting work on platforms like with these short form videos like TikTok about what you get if you do X, Y, or Z in terms of attention, in terms of eyes, in terms of comments. And what that forced me to understand is before you even begin a campaign, before you start to engage with communities, whether it's the wider public or specific segments, we need to understand what is going to be our metric of reach. Is it, I want people to engage in commentary with me. I want to hear what those questions are so I can respond to them. That's very different when saying, I want as many eyes to see this as possible. You may not get the same objectives met with one method. So again, it forces us to try to figure out what are we trying to accomplish? What is the metric by which we're going to say, this is, I think I got something from this. But regarding just the language of how we talk about it, I actually do not believe it is in our interests to move away from the language of clinical trials. I think clinical research will drag us into a forum where we're looking at lab rats and humans in the same way. And it's the same reason that in the academic world, there is a difference between calling something a study and calling something a trial. Because studies could be looking at data that came from, a DNA bank. It could be data that came from a research lab. It could be data that Joe's helps so many people on from a population level or a trial level collection of data. But trials, on the other hand, really speak towards a question that we as human beings are really find really important. So, in the same way that there's language that this era of misinformation has really made quite controversial, vaccine, for example, we need to not see that, but we need to find a way to take it back and restore it to what it really meant. And I think we need to, as much as we support, vaccines as effective ways for populations to get control of disease, we need to figure a way to get that message regarding how trials are the way forward for people who are living with or before they are even diagnosed with cancer.
If I may, because I agree with that. I would not shift to clinical research for a variety of different reasons, and especially in this current era. But I think there's an opportunity amongst the broader community, and so not necessarily patient advocacy, but like the community, to think about participating, being a participant of the research enterprise, meaning that there's the whole prevention opportunity to kind of intervene and start talking about uh, cancer screening. You're part of this entire enterprise of health and well-being, in which participating in a trial is a part of it. It is not sort of like an exceptional activity. It could be part of your journey, your own healthcare journey. And I don't think people think about it that way. And I can, again, share with you and bringing that thought process to African American church, faith-based leaders actually beginning to have those conversations in the context of just regular day-to-day conversations. You've got to normalize this so that when the opportunity presents itself, that it's not something so way outside of the norm that it requires deep thought. And so what I'm advocating for is really thinking about healthcare across a continuum, in which one of the opportunities may in fact be participating in a clinical trial, if that is actually meaningful and makes sense for you. And I'm curious as to the other panelists, is that something that you've thought about, like normalizing the trial concept as a part of healthcare and well-being?
I mean, I'm another panelist. I haven't thought of that. In fact, I was all ready to go all waffly on clinical trial and call it a clinical study or something, but Dawn has stiffened my spine. Thank you, Dawn. I love the way you said it, though, Kristi. I really did. Thinking of a trial as being a part of a continuum of care, which could incorporate everything from childhood vaccines, to end of life participation in a new experimental therapy. That's a really wonderful way to frame it. So I don't have anything to add to it, but other than that, it just struck me as a kind of a novel thought, and I appreciate it. And I would just add, if I could, I mean, I think it's not just communicating to the public, it's communicating to policymakers, right? I mean, you'd be surprised to know, maybe the audience is well, you're not surprised to know there's kind of an attack on clinical research right now, at least as it pertains to federally funded clinical research. And some of the work that we've done in SWOG, that Dawn's familiar with, has been an effort to just show over the decades just what a dramatic impact, taxpayer-funded clinical research, clinical cancer research has had on the behalf of patients and the scientific community over time. It really has been dramatic. Even as the landscape of clinical trial conduct has changed dramatically over the 30 or 40 years. I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, there was very little footprint in terms of industry in clinical trials. Now, 9 out of 10 enrollments to trials are attributable to industry sponsorship, as opposed to federal sponsorship. And so that landscape has really changed dramatically. And I think it's good, right? I mean, industry has achieved a tremendous number of new discoveries and has really spearheaded development of a lot of novel therapies. Of course, that's their mission. But federally sponsored research is not motivated by the bottom line. It's motivated by the questions that patients and researchers have first and foremost, which may not be of interest to industries. Things like combining different treatments from different industry sponsors into a single regimen, or combining modalities. There's very little footprint in that regard on the industry side. So it really is a reciprocal relationship, in my view, between industry and federally conducted research. Industry trials are built on the backbone of NCI infrastructure. If you look where they're conducted where the NCI has NCI designated cancer centers, And that's where they got their start. And yet there's very little feedback, monetary feedback. We basically have built the industry system from the ground up with with taxpayer dollars. So there has to be that reciprocal relationship, because I think it's only that way that you're able to ask all the questions that are important to patients, not just the questions that may be important to industry.
Shelley, can I just quickly, I'm looking just at some of the comments, and when we talk about this communication issue, I just want everyone to realize how important enduring materials are. Okay. So, I'm gonna, so if you're on TikTok, you should follow me because I'm on TikTok at Dr. Dizon. Having said that, I am impressed about how much of the content I posted months and years ago, people are still finding and asking questions about. So that has given me a deeper appreciation for the work that everyone on this panel is doing in the education around clinical trials, whether it's in general or specific, and how important it is that when people search in whatever engine they're doing, that your content is showing up as validated, good information, because there's a lot of information that isn't good and isn't valid out there. So, even if you think it's a quote waste of time to do something on Facebook or to do something on Instagram, if you are doing things that make it searchable, using your hashtags, using tag, whatever tagging thing there is, people can find the information when they need it most. And they are using social media as search engines. So I would encourage you not to focus in on how many people attended today, but to make those investments in ensuring your material lives on well past the point that you did your webinar, did your survey, did your talks that were an in-person event. There is something to be gained by YouTube and social media, and making the most of those events. You may not see the fruits of your labor until months or years later, but it does not mean it was any less important.
Thank you. That's a great point. And definitely follow Dr. Dizon on social media. He has a good social media game, and we could all learn from it. That's great that you're getting interaction with things you posted a long time ago. That's really good to know. We have there were a lot of comments and questions, and we obviously are not going to be able to get to all of them, but I did want to ask about communication around or financial barriers to participation, and the role of communication, and also the role of, efforts to try to compensate patients or help them with their, the non-medical expenses so that they can participate. Anyone?
Can I comment briefly?
Yeah,
Just from the
please.
evidence? I will defer to Dawn and Kristi for more commentary, but the research that we've done showed that lower income patients are less likely to participate in a trial. There are a lot of direct and indirect costs that patients face, and a lot of them are, and I see one referenced in the sidebar about just the challenges of traveling, for an individual and a family. It can be quite prohibitive. And it's going to be differentially prohibitive for those on the lower end of the income scale. At the same time, the ACA Medicaid expansion made trial participation much more accessible for patients with Medicaid insurance. And we showed that a dramatic increase in patients in our trials who had Medicaid insurance after that ACA Medicaid expansion. Now that may be going away to some degree. And so those things are really critically important. But it's not just, some research has said that, trials are not, notably more expensive or just marginally more expensive or what have you. But I wouldn't take that at face value. First of all, on the margin is where people are concerned a lot of times, right? And secondly, it's not just the direct costs. I mean, it can be co-pays, co-insurance, and what have you, but it can also be those travel costs, those childcare costs, having to stay in that hotel that's not compensated for that you mentioned. I mean, those are really important to people.
Kristi, what were the discussions about that when you did the community work in Indianapolis?
That fell in that second bucket of access, right? And so
Yeah.
to your point, being on the lower end of the socioeconomic status made it that much more challenging for participation or even thoughts of participating. So it's not even, I'm in the clinical trial frame of mind. No, they're not, that's not even on their radar. So, if your question is what do we do to tackle that? That's policy. That's a policy question. That's a compliance question, right? Because there are many investigators or many sponsors who say that there's only so much additional support that they can provide to patients compliant from a compliance perspective. Don, I'd be curious since you've run these trials, like has that also been your experience from the other side?
Well, I think it's always a challenge to not only ensure that people can access trials no matter, what their financial circumstances are, what their home situations are. And I do think it is almost a responsibility of investigators to do what they can to help people participate, and to your point, stay on a clinical trial. And oftentimes, and Joe's absolutely correct that, there is a limit, and you stated as much, there's a limit to which industry can support things before, there are questions raised as to motivations. And I think that's born out of historical record, but sometimes I think it's gone to the extreme. I would, I think this is where our social workers actually deserve so much more credit than they get, because they're an arm that really just focus in on clinical care for everybody. But they have, everywhere I've worked, they've taken on that additional responsibility to help me help those people who want to do a clinical trial, ways for them to actually do that. They're the ones who are working with local foundations to help compensate for costs that are not being paid for by the trial, whether that's where to stay, transportation. Even, we had an experience where we actually did a little clinical trial about childcare and whether childcare, providing funds for childcare, which was paid for by a crowd-funded grant, was helpful. And by the way, it was helpful if we provided the childcare, you know. Um, but I think also the messaging is so important on this. I think I'm of a position that everyone, whether newly diagnosed, at risk, or living with metastatic disease, everyone should be asking about a clinical trial. That this is not something that is the terrain of the person who has run out of standard options. But I will say that there are trials that, you should if you can do it, you should do it. And those are the trials that will change our standards of care. Those larger phase 3 trials that are really challenging us to think about what can we do better. Even those phase 2 trials, which, no randomization, but this looks really promising, and now we're trying to get to the bottom of that. When I was at Sloan Kettering very early in my career doing drug development on the phase 1 side, those first in human clinical trials where the objectives weren't response rates, mind you. Those objectives, for the most part, were designed to test safety. What is the safety profile of this new drug that I'm rolling into people for the very first time? And I was pretty consistent in saying one need not necessarily travel for a phase 1 clinical trial. Okay. If it was going to cause so much disruption in one's life, let's find a clinical trial program that is that experimental, closer to home because these phase one trials were helping us develop the drugs that were going to go into phase two and into phase three. To me, it was the biggest, symbol of partnership in the clinical trial world. It was all reflected altruism on the part of patients because they wanted to help us develop a new drug, understanding there may or may not be a benefit to them for that person. We all hope that someone will benefit from a phase one trial, but that the design of those trials was really to get at a safety endpoint. So I was oftentimes looking for local institutions that also had clinical trials with very liberal, eligibility criteria because they were first in human studies. I treated a lot of people from across the globe in New York City and in Boston who traveled for phase one trials. And, while I never said you shouldn't do it, I also was not shy about saying there may be something closer to home for you. So again, our messaging about these trials needs to match, the goals of those trials, and we can't conflate a phase one endpoint with that of a phase three endpoint. It's part of how we need to, and we do. And I think SWOG does a fantastic job of this, as does everyone that I've worked with personally. We really cannot conflate those trials because I think everyone walking into a trial really hopes they're going to benefit.
Mhm.
Shelley, can I just reflect really quickly on something I saw in the sidebar here by
Yeah.
Betty Roggenkamp, who talked about compensation for trial participation, and Dawn mentioned this too. Like I do think we've tipped too far in one direction about trying to avoid undue influence under the U.S. Common Rule. People are very skittish about compensating patients, but if you really want to level the playing field without undue influence, there are lots of ways you can do it. And simply sort of reimbursing patients for costs, which can be complicated in its own right, you know, receipts and all this stuff. Betty mentioned compensating for time as well. And I think that that's something that should be considered seriously. I mean, that idea has been kicked around for 20 years at least. But if you really want to level the playing field and make it easier for patients of all backgrounds, there has to be, in my view, there really has to be more consideration about how you compensate patients for their time and effort.
Thank you. Well, we are over time. Kristi, I'm going to give you a chance if you have any last words that you want to say, since both Dr. Unger and Dr. Dizon just had a chance to make some comments.
All I would like to leave this panel with is I do think as long as we put the patient first, I mean, I think that's an understatement, but one that I think it's important to kind of restate. The other piece is the role of the community and community health workers. We didn't get a chance to talk about them, but if we're looking for a bridge between patients and their community and sort of in the context of recruitment and retention, the role of that community health worker, I think Don alluded to them as perhaps being social workers, but in the event that they're not actually bona fide social workers, there are people in the community that you can lean in and lean on to help with this amazing opportunity to participate in clinical trials. So I just say, keep the patient at the center, think about the community and the role of the community health worker as being a conduit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us. This was a great discussion. I feel like we could keep going for a long time. There were a lot of really great questions that we were not able to get to all of them. I think we touched on a lot of them in the conversation. I really appreciate everyone joining us and to our wonderful speakers for sharing your experience and expertise. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.